Okay, hello everyone. I've got a guest with me today who's new to the channel. Her name is Lulu Minns. She has legal experience and also a very interesting background related to women and gender that we're going to discuss as well. I'm not going to tell you too much about her because she can fill in her background, which is very interesting. I'll just firstly say hello to Lulu and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and thanks for getting in touch as well. I really appreciate it. I know this will be a very interesting conversation. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to let you explain your background because it is quite relevant to the Lucy Letby case.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, and I felt like seeing the case unfold really was a colliding of kind of two worlds that I know fairly well. So the first one is 12 years in criminal defence. So I was a solicitor, not a barrister, but I would say a litigator in the sense of I spent many years and most of my day was at court, or it was in the police station, or it was in prisons giving advice. And I didn't spend a lot of time in the office. Quite often I would be desperate for a day in the office. The minute I was had a full day, I was bored and waiting for something to happen and to go out and represent the clients that we represented. So I had 12 years, and I know we're going to talk about that moving forward. The first part of that, I did a lot of CCRC, Criminal Case Review Commission reviews, which I found really interesting because also my original degree was actually in criminology and sociology, and we learn all about miscarriages of justice and women and gender in the criminal justice system. And I always had a kind of vision to qualify and be a lawyer, and that vision was always really clear to be in criminal defence or the criminal justice system. I wasn't interested in any other area of legal practice. So that, and I was supposed to do my 7 core law modules that you have to do to practice as a solicitor when I did my original degree, but I was too busy enjoying the criminology to do things like contract law and all the other stuff. So I ended up doing a law conversion, then my legal practice course, and working for the firm that I worked at for 12 years, working my way up from a trainee to head of department. And I left that job, I think, is it 10 years? Yeah, just over 10 years ago, possibly 11. I experienced burnout. It's not an easy job. It's a vocation. You live and breathe it, and it can be quite grueling at times. It's a confrontational environment. It certainly was for a young woman as well, although I always fared with that pretty well, but didn't probably take care of myself. And you're also in a negative environment, which I think I went in my first prison when I was 19. So I was 32 or 33 by the time I left. So that was a long time of, being in negative environments.
Mm.
And I started to look into coaching, which kind of happened accidentally. And I began to coach women in leadership and in business, in more masculine dominated roles, such as solicitors. I have coached, or they've attended a few workshops with me, a few doctors and women from all sorts of quite male dominated environments. I've delivered training to the police on women in leadership. I've delivered team away days to government departments and things like that. And I've really extended my understanding and learning, I guess, of human behaviour, which has been a lifelong passion of mine. As has justice. And I can't remember if I've mentioned to you previously, Chris, but I feel like justice, if you like, is in the family genes. My great grandfather was the vicar of Holloway Prison in the 1940s, and my grandfather on the other side was a police officer. So they had, and I'm sure we'll get into that, institutional authority. They, were men in positions of leadership and power. My grandfather was a sergeant. I, in fact, worked with people that met him when he was a police officer, and he died before I was born. But that they're two threads within the family that I've always been quite interested in. And even my great grandmother used to go into Holloway Prison as a listener for the female prisoners.
Mm.
So yeah, that's kind of my background. I've recently written a book on personal growth, and within coaching, looking at things. I've done a 120 hours systemic constellations course, which was really interesting about what happens within family systems and organizations and things like that, as well as human beings and the justice system. is quite dehumanizing, learning to lead more from our heart-based intelligence and not just the linear logical mind. So all sorts of threads that come together.
Yeah, I mean that's really fascinating. I mean, there's so many follow-up questions I could ask you just regards to that. I mean, one thing I definitely want to ask you while I remember is because I'm interested in criminology,
Yeah.
and I went down a different path in life. I'm really glad I did. But one thing I always used to think about with criminology is there's a good, if you're going to do criminal psychology, which I was interested in, you're going to have to go to prisons a lot. Do you
Yeah.
really, is that going to have a good psychological impact on you, you know? So you've obviously done that. So, you know, what is it like? And does it have a dark influence on you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall system, I was so young and naive when I started. I know that some, studies in psychology or sociology, those exploring have actually put themselves in a prison environment. They've actually kind of served a sentence of some degree to
Hmm.
study what was going on inside. And I was like, oh my God, I'd love to do that. And absolutely not now, just going in for 10, 12 years. It really is a dehumanizing environment. I can still, the locking of the doors,
Hmm.
I can still see. And someone was wanting me to, he does some amazing work with men in male prisons. He was like, oh, you should do this with female prisoners. And I'm like, could I go back in that environment? I don't know. I mean, I think I probably could, but it is dehumanizing. And yeah, it's hard to explain unless you're kind of in that. And what's interesting is Holloway prison has now closed, and Pentonville prison has closed, and that they're very closely, in location in London, and they're the older prisons, whereas Bronzefield and, I'm trying to think of some others, are much more modern. And even then, they're not very nice. But Holloway and Pentonville, he had executions in those prisons. That's where they took place. And I
Hmm.
know my great grandfather, he thankfully, as the chaplain, didn't witness any execution, but there were at least two women that he was supporting who were facing the death penalty. That he was, my great aunt's still alive. She's 92. She's amazing. Still talks about now how stressed he was about that actually happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So one aspect of your background that you didn't mention was that you used to instruct the chambers of Mark McDonald at one time. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, when I saw that he was involved in the case, I don't know if I've ever actually met Mark, but his name was familiar to me. And I wonder actually, because he set up the Innocence Project in 2007, and I just left practicing in London at that time. And I think it was on my radar because I'd been working on the miscarriages of justice cases around, was it 2004, 2005, something like that. And I know I've seen him speak, and he said that he'd been sent out to, or he'd done a placement in America, on death row, and that was something I was interested in the early part of my career. So yeah, I looked up which chambers he was in. I used to instruct, in particular, one of the silks that is still a silk at chambers. I always dive into calling them QCs because they were Queen's Counsel, not King's Counsel, when I was in practice. So I'm still tripping over that because I'm not in practice anymore. But they were definitely a chambers that we would instruct in London frequently for the most serious cases that, we came across as a firm.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think is particularly interesting is that you spent 2 years examining CCRC cases, which is it's not easy to come into contact with someone who's done that. So let me ask you firstly, what was that like? Tell me as much about it as you can.
Yeah, it was great. As I said, I had an interest, so I felt really privileged to be able to do that work. And interestingly, because the CCRC was relatively new at that time, it was within its first 10 years. And we had funding, because now I think, I think Mark, for example, is working totally pro bono on Lucy's case. So we were paid relatively well on a page count, as lots of lawyers are, and experts are paid on a page count. So I was a trainee, so relatively inexperienced, but what it, and you have students doing amazing work at universities on miscarriages of justice, because also you haven't become bogged down by the system at that point. You want to find innocence, you want to find new evidence, or procedural issues that have gone wrong. So it was really interesting to get these massive bundles of files, go through all of those. I learned how to apply for the funding, get the funding, and then I would go and take initial instructions from the clients in prisons all over, because it's um, including up north. I went to a number of prisons to take their instructions on what they felt had gone wrong in their case. And then to take that back to the office and speak to the senior lawyers to see if we could find, any grounds. The difficulty at that time was that the funding, and this is always the trouble with the criminal justice system, is because we were quite well funded for it. We'd have a lot of people that didn't have any grounds for appeal. So that was always, difficult to share with them. But since there is now a lack of funding, lawyers are having to step in and not be paid to do work where the representation is absolutely required, because you're far less, chance of having a successful CCRC claim without a lawyer, advising you properly.
Hmm. So that's all interesting. That kind of deals with the everyday reality of doing the job. Um, I know you'll be very well aware that the CCRC has been criticised quite a bit. So, what was your experience of working for it as an organisation? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, 9 times out of 10, we didn't have grounds to actually, push it back to the CCRC. I do think they're important as an institution, although, as with all institutions, there comes massive difficulties. The first one is, my understanding is that funding was cut very early on in respect of the idea of the CCRC, and then funding being cut. And secondly, although I think I looked at some statistics on this, that I think there's been 600 almost successful appeals from the CCRC referring it back, which is an increase when you used to have to lobby, the Home Office and an MP to try and take on the case. But I would say that they are better with cases where there's new evidence rather than a procedural issue or something that's legally gone wrong. And there seems to be a massive gap in the justice system with that. And there's a historic case of Edith Thompson, who was convicted in 1923. Her case was last at the CCRC in 2024, and they still won't refer that back, or for
Yeah.
her to have a royal pardon because of new evidence, because they seem fixated on that as being the only ground of appeal, and there are more than that.
So I mean, you mentioned this case to me when I spoke to you last. I'd never heard of it before. So I looked it up, and Um, you explained to me there's adultery involved. It's a woman, and having an affair basically, and then she was suspected of murdering what was her husband. And I actually read that they referred this to CCRC quite recently. I think it was in 2023.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not going to do a great deal of good at this point because she's been dead for 100 years, but it's an interesting case to look at.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think, whoever is representing her, I don't know if it's a family member who keeps pushing it forward or something. I mean, I don't know a huge amount in his case, but is it Alan Turing, who was convicted of, offences of homosexuality at a similar time? He was pardoned without new evidence, but they distinguish that by saying because he was a war hero, which women don't tend to have the opportunity to be a war hero. So there's a bit of misogyny there that
Mm.
worries me, and that he wasn't morally responsible because obviously, the laws have rightly changed around homosexuality. But the difficulty is, for me in the work that I do, and the article I'm writing, about Lucy's case and miscarriages of justice of women, is that organisations can't see the misogyny that took place in her trial, and they're still not willing to see it 100 laters down the line.
Mm.
That's worrying.
Yes, it is worrying. It's very worrying. So with regard to Lucy's case, how did you first become interested in it? When did you kind of begin following it?
Yeah, it was during the trial itself, because 10 years leaving legal practice, or it would have been just under at that point, I'd switched off from any, criminal
Mm.
cases. I'd, been reading about it for years, doing my degree and all of that stuff. And I've run a podcast myself for a number of years, and I was writing an episode about male authority and how we defer to male authority, interestingly. And I looked up the top 100 podcasts in the UK, and she was number 5. And I was kind of comparing women's names and men's names. And I was like, who's Lucy Letby? Which sounds a bit bonkers, but I try not to read newspapers, although I have been over the last couple of years, because I don't really believe a word that's in them most of the time. So, and I know when I was in criminal practice, the strange reporting of some of the stuff that we were involved in. And I myself was quoted once or twice of things that I'd said, but it was out of context, which
Right.
annoyed me. So I never believe what I read about criminal cases. So my first alarm bell was that, from a criminology perspective, is that we're far more interested in women and deviants than we are and their success, because men were leading politics, comedy, parenting, all sorts of podcasts, whereas the top one for a woman was about criminal behavior, allegedly. So that was my first thought. My second thought was, how on earth is this young woman having a fair trial when the trial is currently in play? And this is one of the most downloaded podcasts in the UK. It was in number 5. So how she had a fair trial? And thirdly, I was like, it just seemed ridiculous. I kind of thought medical negligence is a far more likely reason for unexplained deaths than a female serial killer. It just seemed preposterous to me. Again, from a criminology perspective, female serial killers are such a tiny, tiny proportion, like less than 1%. Most of them have a male accomplice. There's all sorts of, I just thought, how ridiculous. But as I said, I was out of that world. So I thought, it's got nothing to do with you. I'm not going to look into it any more than that. But I'm going to keep an ear out if she's convicted. And if she is, I'm going to read everything I can about it, because something just feels massively off. So that's what I did.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't follow the trial. I didn't hear about it at all. I don't recall ever seeing a report, and I don't follow the news very much for similar reasons, really. And I just happened to hear about it on the day of conviction. So, but I have most people that I've spoken to who followed the trial said, well, I just thought she'd be found not guilty. So it's interesting in that regard. So you've mentioned a few of the red flags from the Lucy Letby case, or certainly your initial concerns. Now you've had a bit more time to look into it and hear about it and so forth. Do you have any kind of further red flags that you might like to add?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many, isn't there? Where do we start? I'm trying to
Yeah.
kind of go in the order that I kind of thought about it, and think about these things, which, two major ones to start with were a lack of motive, which, you don't need that for a criminal conviction 100%. Should you have it in an investigation? Absolutely. Because, the police should be asking why something happens before they're looking at who did it, who's done it. And the trouble with these types of cases is that step, as well as the fact that no crime might have been committed and it's highly likely it wasn't, are kind of totally missed out. So that was a major alarm bell to me. And again, criminology understandings, working in criminal practice for 10 years, reading, I was remembering, actually, preparing for this interview, even when I was at university, I read a book about Mary Bell, who was a young woman who killed another child. I have read and understood, a lot about criminal behavior, and there is always A, some kind of motive, or B, some kind of psychological profile or trauma that sits behind the actions of that person. And, I think it's something like, I don't know, 78%, 80% in terms of serial killers, and I don't like to keep using that term, but have really, really traumatic child histories.
Yeah.
And they've been brought up in an unsafe environment, and they create as is the majority of the criminal justice system, people that are in it, they create unsafe situations. And that just didn't fit in Lucy's profile
Yeah,
whatsoever.
I think the other thing I'd just like to add as well is that you would see a deterioration in her behaviour. There's some sometimes described as criminogenic factors, but you just see that you would see like she'd either be taking drugs or she'd be drinking far too much, or you find some really odd things in her background, or suddenly she wouldn't be socializing, or or a social or a personal life would be in chaos. All these type of things.
Yeah, yeah,
Whereas
yeah. Or
Lucy's,
colleagues saying certain things about, behavior, yeah, not turning up. And another thing, this might sound really bizarre. I've got my two cats hanging around sitting behind me now.
yeah,
Um, having pets, it's something that's massive because
yeah,
it's kindness, care, empathy, all of those things that are present that just didn't make sense. As well as kind of where she was in her career. I was like, she was
yeah,
2 or 3 years qualified in her career. That's when, and I know as a young woman in criminal justice, I was so excited by that point that I'd got my qualifications, that you've got your first 2 years under your belt. You're the most passionate, you know, um, willing to put yourself up for the extra shifts and all of those things to learn, to apply what you've learned. You're not bogged down by the system at that point. Not that that would be an excuse, for any of that kind of behavior, but it just didn't make any sense to me, and neither did uh, healthy babies in inverted commas. I'm not a medical expert, far from it, but I know what a neonatal ward is even before this case. So I was like, surely that's where babies are in incubators and have never been more vulnerable at that point. What kind of narrative is that? That can't be true and that can't be the case. They've got to be highly, highly vulnerable.
yeah. Um, did you see the note early on? Because I saw the so-called confession note and I was like, I mean, come on, this is never a confession note.
Yeah, yeah. I thought, well, I mean, it was on the front of, like you, I became interested, and then it was, kind of on the front of newspaper, or whatever. And it just, again, it seemed to me, if it wasn't so serious, not laughable, but I was just like, well, of course that's not a confession note. What else was said? What else, did she write about within that? And again, there's a really troubling history inspired, by this case in terms of the research that I've done in looking at the words of women that are misinterpreted in male dominated court systems. It's not the first time, and it won't be the last either. So it's really concerning. But it's interesting that the people that you spoke to said that you didn't think she'd be convicted, because a lot of people that I spoke to were like, oh, I thought it was a kind of bang to rights case, and of course she'd done it, and that was that kind of thing. And it's only people that are really starting to question it now, but it just didn't make, and it doesn't make still any sense. And also with the vague suggestion of the prosecution saying she had an inappropriate or affair or whatever it was, suggesting that as a motive is absolutely absurd, as is, I would add, from a gender perspective, saying that she was playing God, because
Yeah.
women don't tend to, you know, to again, from a, I'm not a psychological profile expert, but it's not something women are even grown up to believe that they can be God. So it just seems so far-fetched that, again, there seems no gender understanding of the imbalance of power that was taking place, and
Yeah.
this top down on her, and this narrative that just dominated but made no sense whatsoever.
Well, I mean, I am of the opinion that the reason they put this stuff in about the doctor in the court case is that the prosecution knew we've got to put something in to say there was a motive, otherwise this makes absolutely no sense. I don't think they believed it for 1 second. Um, it doesn't even that doesn't make any sense. It's like, oh, Lucy, you did all this so that you'd get the attention of the doctor. Sure, he had his attention. So she doesn't, it doesn't need
Yeah.
to do anything. It doesn't need to do anything. Why? Oh, they already were friends. Clearly, they had, you got all these messages. They couldn't even find one message that met the bar of flirtation. That's the thing I always point out. It's like if you went through my phone, you'd be able to find them, but
Mm.
they didn't even have one. But the whole premise is, oh, Lucy was doing all this stuff to gain the attention of the doctor. What the doctor is she's already friends with, who she already has the attention of.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. Absolute
No,
rubbish. And
yeah.
I don't think they believed it for 1 second.
No, no, it doesn't. And interesting in some of the research that I've done, with some of even the psychological profiles or, that can be attached to motive that have been put forward over the years, Munchausen's by proxy, Beverly Allitt, Savoy Meadow came up with that one. So, and we know the other cases that he has been implicated in, the miscarriages of justice, which again was, echoing for me in terms of, Donna Anthony, Sally Clark, and Angela Cannings. They were
Mm.
cases that I didn't get overly involved at the time because I was very early in my career, but actually when I was doing the miscarriages of justice CCRC, when you are desperate to find that ground of appeal for someone, I was aware of those cases, in the background, and there was some real similarities that struck. And there's an amazing crime analyst, Laura Roberts. Is it Laura Roberts? She used to work for Scotland Yard. She has, totally ripped she's a behavioural analyst. She has, totally pulled apart the Stockholm syndrome. She was like, that was a male psychologist saying that women get attached to their captors, and it's not. It's actually a trauma response. It's called fawning. You're not actually as physically powerful as that person, so therefore you will comply in order to respond because you know your life's at risk.
Yeah.
There doesn't there's no bond there whatsoever. So again, some of these psychological profiling, particularly for women, it has been made by men with a lack of understanding of actually, women's responses.
Yeah, of course. Seems a pretty ridiculous assertion again, but um, so do you have any reflection on, you mentioned Donna Anthony's, Cannings, Sally Clark's a very famous one. Do you have any reflection on those cases and the kind of the evidence that was used to convict in those instances?
Yeah, again, huge similarities, and immediately my response was hearing about Lucy's case and reading more about it is here we go again. Have we not learnt the lessons 20 years later that we're following a similar line of investigation and unfolding of the case in that, one male expert who has institutional authority, who looks and sounds the part, they actually look very similar to Roy Meadows and Dowie Evans, is overconfident in asserting what it is that they know, and that is enough to convict. And I think women are particularly vulnerable to being blamed for infant deaths. Again, it's something that we've been doing for such a long time in all sorts of ways, shapes, and form within the law. The witch trials are, one of those. That was one of the reasons that small communities, it could be a bad harvest or, infant death or disease within the community. 80 or 90% of scapegoating and blame that went on were of women. It wasn't exclusively, but that was because women had less institutional power. Many were unable to read and write. They may have not had a male advocate husband, or their husband had died, or something like that, or they were a little bit strange, or whatever. But it's not because there was any evidence. It was because it was easy to do, and it is easy to blame women in particular for unexplained infant deaths when there is a far more complex explanation for that. And Dowie Evans, I think, like Roy Meadows, didn't exclude all of the, genetic, environmental, systemic factors that impact that. So it really had remnants of that. And what's interesting actually about also, as we talk about imbalance of power, Sally Clark, Donna Anthony, and Angela Cannings, trying to get their names right. Sally Clark was a solicitor. So she had some degree of institutional awareness and understanding. She had a husband and a family who lobbied on her behalf. So hers was the first appeal. That's why it's the most famous, because they had, some nounce to challenge that evidence and the money, I would say, to do so as well. Her life ended tragically once she was, released from prison. She died of alcohol poisoning because it's bad enough losing a child, let alone going through that horrendous experience.
Mm.
And then I think it was Angela Cannings came on the back of that a year later, and then Donna Anthony was 2 or 3 years down the line because she was of, lower socioeconomic background. She didn't have a partner and all of those things. So, we can think, oh, witch trials that long ago, but that institutional power is still a factor in terms of how long it takes and who is able to actually challenge a miscarriage of justice. And, as we've seen, and as we've already talked about, Mark McDonald pro bono, because there
Yeah,
isn't voice
there's
in this case.
not the resources. Yeah. Yeah, so that's all really interesting, looking at these cases historically, and of course, what they have in common is it's all women as well. So I want to discuss with you one of the primary reasons wanted to have you on, and we'll definitely have you back in the future to discuss um, issues related to women, issues related to gender. I know this is the work that you're kind of involved with now, and it's something that I've touched upon in my book and I've mentioned on this channel, but I don't think I've done it enough. But it's very difficult to cover everything with this case, and particularly in the book, I just couldn't go into this enough. But I wrote that the case has a stench of classism and a distinct whiff of misogyny.
Yeah.
So I know that you agree with this. I just like to hear, firstly, your full view on that.
Yeah. No, and I love that as a quote, if you like. And I think we've already touched upon the class issue, but me looking into it more, and the information on your podcast is so powerful and useful. So I'm grateful to you for that. I thought you could have with the institutional part. I'm going to just stick to the classism bit slightly, is that what you have is, and I was going to create a diagram and I haven't done it yet, but I've got a hand drawing, is you've got two institutional bodies, that the medical system and the criminal justice system, kind of sitting on top of Lucy and the plumber, who have, just if you think of it like that, is where institutional power comes in, or class, or anything else. You can see how difficult, even with a huge lack of evidence, which there was in my opinion, is that how can they possibly challenge that when their voice and what it is that they say is not taken as seriously as a medical doctor, and the barristers and all of that kind of stuff. So I think there were elements of that that were massively missed in terms of the misogyny. It's so hidden in these types of cases. One of the elements in the article that I'm writing is that there is almost a deletion of women's voices, or what it is that they say is totally dismissed. And that was littered across this case, and I've learned a lot of that from listening and watching your podcast. And there can be all sorts of reasons for that, absolutely, but it's undeniable that Michelle Warden or Jane Hutton or these women, Lucy's best friend, who was too fearful to speak up.
Other nurses were
Other
saying,
nurses,
"Oh, don't speak out, or we'll destroy your career."
yeah,
Basically, that's what they were told. I mean,
yeah,
it was put more euphemistically, obviously, but
yeah. And we've seen it, in other cases. It's and who knows. I've got a few theories on why the defence didn't have expert evidence, but Dr. Wayne Squires, I know you know about this,
mm,
who challenged the status quo of evidence that's being given in baby shaking cases, was struck off. She challenged that, she won that, but her career was over. And I don't think, and I'm going to put that out there, if she was a male expert, she would have had that backlash from her professional authority, which is the same as Charlotte Proudman had that from the Bar Council, because she spoke out about a judge in a family law case on Twitter. The last I heard, she's actually taken the Bar Council to court for, she won the claim against her. I think Mark McDonald is involved, so as well, interestingly. So there's lots of interconnections there, but with the silencing of women and not listening to women's voices is done way before the courtroom happens. And I think that's really important for institutions to understand how that happens, and that it is happening. and what a risk that women face when they're in these situations. The case of Amanda Knox in Italy, she was convicted of killing her housemate, even though they'd apprehended the man who had, sexually assaulted and killed her. But the suspicion was already on Amanda. She spent 4 years in custody. She's out there talking and doing amazing work. Currently, that she said that it was like she was fighting a mythology against her and not the facts, and that's really, really hard to fight.
That's
You know
exactly what's happened in Lucy's case.
exactly.
If
Totally.
anything, it's worse. Because
Yeah.
here the mythology got bigger, didn't it?
Is what?
The mythology just took on some mammoth
Yeah.
scale in this
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, it absolutely took on a mammoth scale. And what the prosecution do in these types of cases is they, whether they're aware of it or not, but the amount of work and stuff that I've looked at over the years is that they tie into almost religious mythological women to to attach to some narrative that is not actually true. It's interesting, but for Amanda Knox, for example, she was like the femme fatale. They totally sexualized her, and the press backed it up. There was absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. They just went and ran with it, and and what's so interesting is even when I talk to people about this stuff now, they go, "Oh well, she didn't really help herself." And I'm like, what how are you supposed to help yourself in that situation? It's really, really difficult, and there are a lot of parallels with their cases and how they were dealt with.
Yeah, this is a bit of a going off piste, but there's a film called, I think it's called One Night at McCall's. Have you ever heard of that film?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so I've never watched it, but it's not really highly regarded or anything. But I think it's an interesting premise. And basically, there's a female character who's played by Liv Tyler, and various men who knew her or know her recount various stories about her from their perspective. And it's all relate. I've thought about this when I spoke to you first, and you were talking about how, you know, men will tend to put women in a box or, in certain roles, like you said, they've sexualized Amanda Knox. And in this film, they all tell their stories, but it's kind of a satire showing they just put this woman into a box that is
Mm,
based on their preconceived ideas of who she is. I've
mm,
never actually watched it, but it's quite interesting, and it just made me think of that when you
yeah,
when you mentioned this to me before. What
yeah, it's a bit,
something I can tell you that I think you'll be interested in is that right at the start of Nick Johnson, the prosecuting barrister, cross-examining Lucy, right at the start, he says, words to the effect of, "I might raise my voice while I'm speaking to you," and he may say something else as well, and he says, "That's not to deliberately upset you. It's not to demean you in any way, or words to this effect."
mm,
Uh, and he gets Lucy to accept that, and I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Half of me is, and half of me thinks, well, you did very deliberately set out to upset her, and you did very deliberately set out to demean her and dehumanize her. If you
mm,
look at what actually happened in court.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I,
yeah, yeah. And you're on what he's doing there, is almost asking her permission, right? Oh,
Hmm.
oh, it's okay, that I'm going to do that, and I'm going to get favor of the jury, in order to do that. And it's interesting you said about the film. I've not seen it, but in the book that I've written about personal growth, which is about it being cyclical, not linear, which I tie that into the voices of women, or feminine intelligence being deleted from the mainstream, is that I talk about Virginia Woolf, a lot in her A Room of One's Own, where she says, "Oh, there's so much written about women, but it's all written by men, right?"
Hmm.
And she wrote that only 100 years ago, and she's imagining women, in their genius in 100 years' time, which is we're almost at that point. And I'm like, well, Virginia, we're not that far ahead, because stuff like this is still happening, where there is a strong male dominated narrative that's tied to, in my opinion, religious, medical and legal roots of a male hierarchy system. The medical system, for example, saw women as biologically and intellectually inferior. That wasn't that long ago.
Mm.
And women still fight now to have diagnosis and to be fully understood as to what pain they may be experiencing. It's kind of, oh no, that's just that. And it's that institution that Lucy loved and was working within, and would have been far too young to realize the power that it yields. And that was the same for me within criminal justice. um
Yeah, I think for Lucy, um, when you look at the way she's responded, we'll get into this if we get that far today. When we look at how far the way she responded in the police station. So you that actually, and it's noticeable actually for me as well. Her parents are quite a lot older than her, um, so they're of a generation that are more trusting. Like I know what my grandparents were like. My grandparents just completely trusted the system to a degree that was, it's hard to almost explain. I remember having this conversation with my grandma once about someone had fobbed her off on some pension thing or something like that, and I was trying to explain. She was saying, "Oh, the person on the phone said, I have to phone up in 6 weeks." And I said, I know they said that. I know they said that, but you've got the right to phone them now. They just said that and I would say that to her and she'd say, yeah, but the person on the phone said, yeah, I know the person on the phone said that, and I could never get through to her. We weren't, I spent 15 minutes trying to explain to her, just phone them up and say, this is my right to have this. She wouldn't do it.
yeah,
She wouldn't do it. So I think Lucy's parents are close to that generation. And everything about her response says to me, she believed in the system, and she was probably brought up that way. And she thought, if I just sit here and tell the truth, and if I cooperate, I will be exonerated.
yeah.
And unfortunately, she found out that's not true.
Yeah, 100%. I think, and I know I've said to you, it was a sign for me, and that's when I, recommitted myself to finding out more about her case, because I was arguing with someone about it in my office. I have a co-work space of what I do now, about the fact that she'd not come up to be sentenced, and the government were responding, as the system does, of like, oh, we'll just change the law and we'll force defendants. I'm
Mm.
like, from the first off, I've seen certainly witnesses and defendants be dragged into court against their will, and it's not very nice. It's traumatizing for everybody in that room, dealing with already a traumatic situation. And I'm trauma informed and I educate myself about it all the time. But secondly, for Lucy, I was like, that indicates to me someone who's complied throughout, who believed in the system, who believed if she just told the truth, if she did everything that was asked for her. That's despite losing her job, being arrested, interviewed, from what I've read, 30 times,
Mm.
and then, complying with the trial, being sent to prison and losing her liberty. Suddenly, her confidence and her trust shattered in that moment by refusing to come up to the courtroom.
Yeah,
Um, but no one asked the deeper questions. They were like, oh, let's just yield more power and control, and give the public what they want.
yeah, absolutely. So I want to get into the whole police situation and some of
Yeah,
the related issues. So firstly, this is just something that I've thought of previously as we're discussing these issues of class and the consultants being believed, etc., etc. So the question I always pose, and it's pretty much a rhetorical question, is if Lucy or any other nurse had just walked into the police station, which is pretty much what Breary and Jairam did. Susie
yeah,
Holt was there as well, but she says almost nothing in that meeting. It's pretty much Breary and Jairam. 95% of that meeting is Breary and Jairam. Imagine Lucy going in, or any other nurse from the Council of Chester, and then saying, "Oh, I think male consultants are killing babies on the unit. It's all very suspicious. They're there all the time when it's happening, and I suspect it's very likely that there's something unsuspicious. Would that have been taken seriously?"
yeah, absolutely, 1 million% no. We hear about people, trying to report crimes all the time. Particularly as an example, and an example of who is listened to in the system and who isn't. Women, for example, who are stalked by partners, ex-partners, it's usually a build up, something much more serious happening, are ignored. Within Peter Sutcliffe case in Yorkshire, from many years ago, he, again, women were saying all sorts of things and they weren't listened to, and he would have been apprehended much more quickly had those women been listened to. And I know from being, a young woman, I was, funnily enough, in a similar age bracket to Lucy when I was in criminal practice. If I wasn't known at a police station or a court, they would think that I either didn't know what I was doing, which I sometimes used to my advantage because I absolutely did, or B, I was even refused at court once to be let into the cells to see my client because they thought I was a relative. you know I was like, I knew the guys in the grey suits with the grey hair were not having that issue because they were asking me, have I got ID? And I was like, I've never had ID to go into a cell before. And I had an argument with them about being an officer of the court, and I'd just done a bail application. I was like, I've just done a bail application. I wasn't asked ID, so why am I being asked the ID? But that was because I didn't have the institutional authority, and I wasn't listened to as my male counterparts were, and that is unfortunately still true of the police in terms of who they listen to and who they don't listen
Hmm.
to.
I mean,
And these were men in similar positions of power to them.
I mentioned this on the channel before, but the guy out of Lost Prophets who is now dead, who'd been to prison, committed horrendous crimes. His girlfriend shipped him. She was trying for years to get the police to investigate him. She was obviously correct, and she ended up being prosecuted. She was prosecuted,
Yeah,
and they lost in court, but they could very easily have won, and then
yeah,
she would have gone to prison. And she's obviously completely innocent. And they
yeah.
never
And it wasn't.
apologize. They never apologize. That's the thing. They never say, "Yeah, we were wrong," or anything like that. They just
No.
say, "Oh, we were entitled to pursue this, and we've done all the right things." Blah blah blah. You know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's exhausting, and yeah, I've seen you use that example before. And again, it's that not listening. It's just literally like that's not. And I experienced in criminal justice. It wasn't all the time, but again, either I'd be in front of a judge who didn't know me, and that they I'd have to overwork to prove I was good. Compared to my male counterparts, or they thought again I was relatively inexperienced, and I'd been on my feet for 8 years. And other times I had male colleagues, so who they were other solicitors, they didn't work with me, but they'd interrupt me because they felt that they could, and that they had more authority than me in some way, shape, or form. And I gave as good as I got because
Hmm.
as a defence lawyer, I was paid and trained to throw it back. But it was frustrating, and I didn't realise until I left how exhausting that was, on top of an already exhausting job, having to constantly kind of prove that you have some institutional authority. Saying that, the police stations and courts that I was in regularly, they knew to take me seriously because I'd earned it.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
I was
But just the simply the usage of that phrase, you've earned it. I mean, I wouldn't need to, would I? I mean that's the point, isn't it? Like, why should I, if I was a solicitor, why should I automatically have that social proof just because of my gender?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Why
yeah,
should you have to earn it?
yeah, yeah. It's bonkers, and it's frustrating, and it's something that I was totally naive to when I went into it. I just didn't. I think I said to you before, I grew up in an independent record shop. With lots of musicians and people who are probably quite defiant against the system, and I've got two sisters. I was kind of taught by my dad and my mum, you can do anything you want, and you absolutely can, but I didn't realize the challenges that were there, and also as women in the job I was in, if you're very assertive, you're called aggressive, feisty, all the names come with it. You're not very nice because, you're trading that off to be successful. There's all sorts of other dynamics which come into play. And that is absolutely true within the police as well. So they are not used to still, unfortunately, listening to women. My grandfather, who was a police officer, as I said, he didn't think women should be in the police.
Yeah, it was terrible.
Mm.
Um, so we're going to talk about the police, but I just want to ask you one other question first, because I find this fascinating.
Yeah,
And that is that certainly in the media, some of the strongest pro-guilty advocates have been female, and some of the harshest critics of Lucy have been female. I mean, I think the strongest would be Liz Hull, and obviously there's Judith Moritz as well. And then there are others that are perhaps less prominent. And in particular, not only have they criticised her, not only have they very strongly come down on the side of guilt, but they've also focused on her demeanour or what they perceive to be unemotional responses, even her clothing and appearance. So I mean, I find that really odd and distasteful. Do you have any comment on that from your perspective and your experience?
Yeah, 100%. You know, I tried to listen to Judith Maritz's book and I just, no. I stopped. It just felt off. I was like, no, 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 this is not, the right narrative at all. And, it's unfortunate within male-dominated systems that, it's not just men or all men that perpetuate it. There are women and they learn the cultural and inherited language to go down that road. And in fact, I think sometimes can be worse in terms of holding women to a ridiculous standard or expecting them, that's across the board, but to perform innocence in a particular way that they deem as appropriate. And it's just, and even one of the prosecutors, actually, I can't remember her name now, but I watched a video and she was going down the road of, she called Lucy seductive, right? I was like, okay, here we
Mm.
go again. There's some almost sexualization again, as well as the cold and the calculating and the too calm. And I think we all have a massive responsibility if you're going to work in crime, or report on it. Need to be trauma informed, and you need to be aware of the things that you are saying that are actually feeding into a high likelihood of a trauma response. Now, I think Lucy did remarkably well, and I know we're going to talk about the police interviews of how she gave an account and things like that. But you're kind of damned if you do and doomed if you don't as a woman. Either, as I said, you're called aggressive or unfeminine if you're too assertive, to this, to that, or you are too calm,
Mm.
trying to give your account and to clarify and not react, and then you're called cold and calculating and everything else. I mean, it's probably a trauma response and huge fear of this, power that you're suddenly facing and on your own to push back on that. So I'm not surprised. And again, when I've heard it, when I've read it, I thought this is so typical
Mm.
of we've been talking about this in criminology for God knows how long. One of my tutors, actually, Sandra Waltlake, she's one of the biggest or most academic person who's written a lot of books about gender and women in crime. Can't remember if she's written specifically about that, but I was just very familiar with it, which made it even more full of alarm bells,
Mm.
in language that was being used. And actually, weaponizing women's behavior is one of those steps of those imbalances of power. And we see it with politicians as well. I was thinking, I can't remember which politician, it might have been Theresa May. She was dancing at an event and everyone was like, oh, she's too masculine, she's too this. And then you have Jacinda, New Zealand Prime Minister. She was too attractive. She was too, like, again, it's across the board. Whichever way women go in certain environments, they're criticised. And crime is magnified of that, and women are the worst for doing it to other women. Although I've definitely seen in the last 10 years the tide is changing,
Mm.
that, and women are starting to be aware of it. But that, on top of the fact, people working in crime reporting on it, please be trauma informed.
So with that being said, even so, maybe I mean I would consider myself to be quite empathic. So perhaps this is an element of my character that informs this, but I still find it extraordinary that you wouldn't be sitting there watching someone in the witness box and thinking, how would my first thought would be, how would I feel in that situation? I mean, I wouldn't even be, I wouldn't in any way be assessing the case by how the person presents anyway. I think it's a nonsense. I mean, I think you put it beautifully to say, present. How can you present as being innocent? How can you do that?
How does
You,
that look?
it's just impossible.
Yeah,
But I mean, so I wouldn't assess it by that in the first place. But my first, and we know the thing is, we know a lot now. Or I mean, I've spoken to people on the channel. We've read about this. Lucy went, even just the trial is an enormously traumatic experience because she's got to get up, she gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning. She's driven across the Pennines. She's already in prison. She had a nervous breakdown before the trial began. What, how could you possibly say, well, I'd expect her to behave like this, or I'd expect her to behave like that? I just cannot understand how someone, immediately I would be thinking, how would I feel? How would I feel in these circumstances? And I just find it extraordinary that they can't do that.
I know, I think, and it's, even without the getting up at 5 a.m.,
Mm.
even if you had like a five-star hotel attached to a
Mm.
trial of that magnitude, like people just totally underestimate the impact of that, and everything that kind of came before it as well is. But people will say to me, and unfortunately, I think there's the 80/20 rule. Lots and lots of people and professionals, they think they're judge and jury. I mean, people might say that about us. We're challenging, a conviction that's happened. But the biggest question that I was asked and still am asked in defence, well, how do you defend people when, they're guilty or they're not? Because it wasn't my job.
Mm.
It wasn't my job to decide whether they're guilty or innocent. And I would deal with everything impartially and upon the evidence and advise accordingly and protect my clients from the systems and structures that have far more power than they do. And it's unfortunate journalists don't do the same. Report on it. That's what you're there to do. Although interestingly, the printing press was actually rising, and gathering momentum a lot at the same time as the witch trials. They're very closely connected. They always have been, and that's why I don't believe a word that I read, um, when the press report on criminal cases, and particularly with women.
Yeah, so when we spoke, you were talking about this. Let me try and remember what you said. You were talking about I can't remember now. I can't remember now. Let me just ask you the next question instead. But you said something that triggered me, but I can't remember what it was. So let's just talk about the police.
Yeah.
So you've worked as a solicitor for many years, as we know. You've dealt with the situation Lucy's in, where she's in the Blacon police station just outside Chester. Um, so I know I was going to ask you now. I know I was going to ask you. So when we spoke previously, you you were talking about when you defended someone who was guilty, or that you had a suspicion maybe guilty, or so forth, and you said some stuff about my job is still to hold the system to account, and the system is really powerful, etc., etc. So could you just explain that, please?
Yeah, it's as I said, in terms of, it wasn't my job to decide, but often you would get an indication, and quite often you were representing clients over and over again, the same people,
Right.
right?
Okay.
And the same family members, and all of that kind of stuff. So, oh yeah, I remember what I said. So even if a client was, to use legal language, banged to rights, they were guilty. It was quite obvious on the evidence, in those scenarios that they might not give you any instructions because they know that they're guilty, and it's all going to go one way. I would still challenge the police or the courts or whoever for cutting corners and doing things that they shouldn't be doing, because it might not matter in that case. 9 times out of 10 it didn't matter in that particular case, but it mattered for how we do justice overall. And that was really important to me because, I had I think once a client, well, not once, many times, but all on CCTV, him doing X. It's the same offence, 16, 32 times, I think that was, and then he wanted bail. It was not happening. But they got him to sign something on the way to the police station, and he couldn't read and write. So, you know, I had to do what I needed to do in that scenario, although it wasn't going to make a difference. He was going to be convicted and he was going to be remanded in custody. But it's me reminding the police, of justice, and not to cut corners, and abuse their position of power. And also from a professional level, it taught them also not to do that when I was involved in a case.
Yeah. Do you know about Operation Own Goal? Have you ever heard of that before?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So this was the police. They infiltrated the Chelsea headhunters hooligans in the 1980s. Obviously, it's died down a lot since then because it's much harder to do football hooliganism now.
Yeah.
Um, And these people were football hooligans, and they all went to prison, or several of them went to prison. But the police had like fabricated evidence, and I believe they fabricated evidence. But they certainly made some major blunders, conscious blunders as well, and they had to release them all. I think the most compensation one of them got was 150,000, like in 1988 or 89, and they were guilty. They absolutely were football hooligans, but
Yeah.
they just cocked up the process and procedure. So that's a reminder of what you're saying is that you have to get things right.
Yeah, and I had a client actually, and he was very happy, who got a lot of compensation because he was unlawfully arrested, when he had a warrant backed for bail, not a warrant not backed for bail, right? So it was misread, on there, and he was homeless, and he was annoyed at being arrested, and I was already at custody, and I explained to the sergeant that's it's the wrong blah blah blah. He was like, there's nothing I can do about it. It was an unlawful arrest. He got a payout for it. You know, Saying that, he was the client that was arrested the most of mine. He was in and out of there constantly. But
Mm,
you've got to get it right because otherwise, sloppy work
mm.
makes miscarriages of justice much more likely. People don't
Yeah,
realise until, they face the system.
absolutely. So we've talked about the guilty scenario. So now there's the inverse situation. So you're walking into the police station as a solicitor. You've got your client. You very strongly believe them to be innocent, or you think they have good cause to be exonerated. Can you describe what that's like?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would try not to go down the innocent or not innocent road. I would really look at the evidence and what it is that we were facing. In all honesty, as I said, saying that, what I can do is compare to definitely clients who had absolutely no record and no previous contact, and the stakes are much higher for them. Not that I would put in less effort for my regular clients, absolutely not, but it's understanding that the stakes are much higher. And also, when we use the word innocence, for example, I often say, particularly in defense, I think prosecution see things as black and white. I didn't. I was like, it's usually murky gray in the middle. Actually, it's usually six of one, half a dozen of the other. Something's happened. It's not quite what they've said. It's not quite what my client said. It's kind of something in between. Or self-defense is a classic. Innocent, are you innocent? It depends whether the self-defense is actually reasonable in the circumstances or not. If you tell the police that you're acting self-defense, the likelihood is you'll be charged and taken to court. So and the court will decide whether you are innocent of that or not. So I would really see again me as protecting my clients from the process and the system. But I certainly dealt with a few baby shaking allegations and things like that,
Mm,
uh, where I definitely trusted in what my clients were saying, and also felt that the police and the investigating officers would lose their heads a little bit in how they're investigating it and become quite fixated on a particular outcome or a particular perpetrator when it was far more complex than your average crime.
mm,
um which I go back to, most crimes, a crime has actually happened.
mm,
There's lots, these kinds of cases, there hasn't been one.
mm,
So it's like that first step's missed. And to be fair to the police, it is a really tough job. And 99.9 times out of 10, they're dealing with some real horrible stuff.
yeah, yeah.
And threatening clients, people who are distressed. It's very easy to. I do think people should have sabbaticals from these types of jobs to
Mm.
remember that it's not everywhere all of the time, because it's not.
Well, it's interesting you should raise that because I believe, and I've probably stated this, I'm sure I have, that constantly being surrounded by crime, and we know they get things wrong, of course they do, but a lot of the time they're just dealing with people where there's definitely a crime, they've definitely got the right person, and some of them are probably scroats, for want of a better term. And, eventually, I believe psychologically, you can just start seeing crime everywhere, you
Yeah.
know. And I think that's a very good reason, as you mentioned, to have a sabbatical and just say, oh, you know what? There isn't crime everywhere. Most people live crime-free days every day of their life, in fact.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
you can almost be. I know, towards the last couple of years, I was almost getting there, not quite, but almost like, oh, can I be bothered to watch the CCTV? Because it will be what they've told me it is, and then actually it'd been cut, perhaps. But also being so, what's the word? I think my mum and sister were like, things like that don't happen all the time, and I'm like, yes, they do, But that was my daily experience was that they do.
hmm,
Uh, saying that, what I did understand was most crimes are committed against and by, not all, I would say, a caveat to that, within people within their own, you know. I'm like,
but yeah.
again, I don't get freaked out particularly when the press report XYZ's gone up, and I'm like, oh, okay, well that will be, kids stealing drugs or, whatever. They're in that. It doesn't need to impact me as a passerby who's, going about my daily business. I don't really worry about things like that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. Um, so last time we spoke, you raised concerns that I think many people have, including myself, about Lucy's solicitor and police station representation. So what exactly would you have expected a solicitor to do differently during Lucy's interview?
Yeah. Again, it's a tough job. I know when I was training to give, because I should add, you don't just automatically have the right to give police station advice when you're a solicitor. You have to do a separate qualification in order to do that. And I also trained members of staff to do that qualification as well. And it's difficult because you have, and I don't know if it's helpful to talk about a little bit of the procedure here. You get a call, someone's arrested, you know what the offence is, you'll give them initial advice, usually advising them to say absolutely nothing until you get there and for the interview. So you'll have an indication as to what the case might be about. Um, but it might not be you that goes and deals with it. It might be somebody else, or it might be passed on to you. You then go and deal with it, and you get what's called disclosure. It's given to you by the police, which can be, it can be lengthy. It can be, a page of A4. It can be, I had benefit agency write it on a post-it note. It can be all sorts of, disclosure, and then you can ask questions about what it is they want to talk to your client about. How much of that they answer really depends. You will then go straight into consultation with your client. You will need to advise them whether they're answering the police questions or not, and then you go straight into interview. So you haven't got time to think. And I know, when I first started, I was like, God, I haven't got time to call a colleague or anything. I've just got to, I've just got to pull it out, and I've got to do it. So there's that. Obviously, Lucy was advised to, I'm surmising here, but to answer the questions. As I said, I think she was interviewed in excess of or around 30 times over a 3-year period, 2018, 2019, 2020. My advice may have differed, but and we've only got, I think there's only one or two interviews, isn't there? I've certainly read through one of them from 2019, I think.
There's
Um,
a few, but
yeah,
it's a small proportion of the overall process.
yeah, yeah. I've certainly gone through the one that you did the video on. And the solicitor obviously interjects at a particular moment and mentions something that they spoke about earlier on. And I think that's the only time within the
What?
interview.
Yeah. I've only seen one, and it is literally exactly what you said. What were you saying earlier, Lucy? That's basically
Yeah,
what I said. Yeah.
yeah, which is what a solicitor's permitted to do. My concern is, and I've got hindsight bias in terms of how this unfolded,
Hmm.
is that there was opportunity to support her in clarifying more what she meant around particularly the handwritten note, which we've talked about unfolded in the trial, and also the handover notes. And then there was another issue, which I'll get to that in a moment, because what the likelihood is that the police would have disclosed prior to the interview that we have a handwritten note where she's written XYZ, and we have mementos, right? That's what they said in the interview. They were mementos, the handover notes that she'd accidentally taken home. And I think Lucy did remarkably well But I think there was room for more clarification as to the note, but also, I mean, how common I used to find police tapes in my at my, that's that I'm showing my age now. They used to be on tape when I first started, police interviews. We take them home, we listen to them. I found some of that even, even when I left. The police will know as well. They have stuff at home, doing a confidential job that they shouldn't have, and it doesn't mean anything more than that. So either the police would have disclosed to the solicitor before that they were deeming this as mementos. If they didn't, I would have interjected at that point and said, is there something you haven't disclosed to me? Oh, what, you're actually saying the handwritten notes are mementos. Interesting. Maybe stop and speak to my client, etc. And or that was all disclosed before. And yeah, you can't put words in your client's mouth and stuff, but in consultation prior to the interview, probing, pushing them, making it difficult for them to answer that, with you prior to going into an interview, so you fully understand and get the full explanation from them for something that magnitude would be absolutely critical in my view. And there was room to help her take control of the narrative, which we know ran from that interview right through into the trial, which it just seemed too late to push back on it. My other concern was, and I don't know if I'm correct in this, and I don't know if it was that interview or later down the line, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that I think she was kind of backed into a corner at some point in accepting, because the interviews for 2019 would have been because they'd also got the medical evidence from Dowie Evans, right? That's why, and they'd gone through all the contents of her home when they raided it on the first arrest, and that's all they found. But that she was kind of backed into a corner in terms of medical evidence to accept, and I think this ran through the trial as well, which just blows my mind, that one or maybe two of the babies had been poisoned with insulin, but it wasn't from her.
Yeah.
And she's not medically qualified to comment on that. So again, that would have been something that would have been disclosed prior to the interview. And my gut instinct on it is that certainly for 2019 interviews in 2020, I would advise no comment.
Yeah, and you told me that 9 times out of 10, your advice would be to a client to avoid answering questions. So, we're not here to bash the solicitor, but what on earth was he doing?
Yeah, I know, and absolutely we're not. As I said, it's difficult in hindsight, bias, but I can compare it to a case I dealt with, previously, that baby shaking allegation. They've been interviewed a year before, and it's standard. A year later they come back with the medical reports. I advise no comment because they'd already given an account, because you've also got the time lapse, and the police are not supposed to, but they do use it as a comparison of what you said before and what you said a year later, whereas they're only actually supposed to put the new evidence, but they don't. It's not, it's not what happens. And again, like Lucy, clients of exemplary character, they are the type of people that want to answer the questions.
And I should say they did that in this case. They did that not even over a year. They asked her a load of questions about the handover sheets, and then they asked her again the next day. So it wasn't even over a year. Yeah,
Yeah,
they,
I'd love to go through it all, but it would actually be a great training for, again, not the bachelor solicitor, but for people training to do police station advice, because that just should not be happening. And there isn't, again, I'm not saying that's what happened in this case, but I would call it a lazy approach, and I saw it, and I didn't practice it myself, in that, oh, a client's guilty, you answer no comment. They're innocent or they've got an account, you put it down in the interview, and you do that to avoid adverse inferences at the trial, that so you don't get inferences that you've later said something that you're now relying on in court that you didn't say in your interview. And to me, that's lazy. It doesn't take account of the power imbalance, because, as I said, someone like Lucy and similar clients I had, of good character, but in your general day-to-day clients, mental age, capacity, understanding, how drunk they were, The list goes on of things that you might need to step in and protect their rights. And I saw a lot of messes being made in answering questions when just the simple response is not answer the questions. And I had a lot of clients where charges were dropped because they didn't answer the questions. And again, people of good character,
Mm.
uh, you know, as I said, you put self-defense down, you're going to court most likely to decide whether that's reasonable or not. So you've got to check before, is there an ID issue? Because if the client can't be ID'd, should they be putting self-defense down? And you can also read out a written statement at the beginning of the interview. The solicitor would do it. If I advise clients of no comment, I would always tell the police when I introduce myself in the interview, my client will be exercising the right to silence during this interview, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes I would then outline a defence. So the client can't be accused of making it up. I'm outlining it, but we're not answering your questions.
Mm. So I personally am slightly confused about the right to remain silent. So in a video I made recently, Danielle Stonier, who conducted two-thirds of Lucy's interviews, she basically said, "Where's the effect of, or the person being interviewed can't just say no comment." Um, so someone picked me up on that. So I kind of I thought the law had changed or practice had changed or whatever. I don't know. So a couple of people have picked me up on that in the comments, and um, could you just explain what the situation is, basically? Because I don't
Yeah,
really.
yeah. As far as I'm still aware, no, to do a bit of double checking. All police interviews are still governed by, it's called PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, which is when they brought in tape recording interviews because of a lot of miscarriages of justice and false confessions and all of that kind of stuff. Birmingham 6, Guildford 4. Um, some of those being involved in that. So yeah, and the caution at the beginning of the interview. Um, which I can read actually because I thought we might, and the amount
Okay.
of times I've heard it and I still trip over it, I was like, I'm going to write it down, is that you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. So yeah, what that basically means is you can answer no comment throughout the interview, but
Yeah,
an adverse inference can be drawn at court
yeah,
from the fact
yeah.
that
It
you
can be used against you, of course, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um,
And
yeah,
also what's absolutely critical in there, which is something that I would never forget. And I think yes, the police's job is to establish the facts, but their first and foremost primary role is to gather evidence.
yeah, yeah,
That's what they're doing.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you something very specific. This seems like the right time. So when I'm watching this process, and I think this relates to the insulin cases as well.
Hmm.
So with the insulin cases, Lucy gave a very reasonable response, but it was slightly different to what I would have said. So she basically said, "Well, if you're saying that someone's been poisoned by insulin, fair enough, but it wasn't me, right?" Whereas what I would have said is, well, I'm not medically qualified, so I can't comment on that. All I can say is I've never poisoned anyone with insulin ever, under any circumstances, I never would. I would, because in a way she is tacitly accepting what they're saying, whereas I would just say, well, I can't comment on that.
Yeah.
All I can do is say that I haven't done it.
Yeah.
And that would then be not. So that feeds into what I'm about to say, which is I want to acknowledge firstly that I'm a lot older than Lucy. I have that inbuilt skepticism.
Yeah.
I'm male. I'm more assertive. Words and language and communication are what I do. I'm pretty confident if you put me in front of the police, and I don't have this inherent trust, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
But even if you take all that into consideration, the first thing I would say, I'm being bombarded with all these questions, I would say, why are you asking me this? Why are you asking me these questions? Why are you asking me, why did you do this? Or why did you do that? That would be the first thing that I would do because obviously I'm innocent. I would want to know, why do you want to know this? And I would generally ask as many questions to the police as possible, particularly in that situation, just to hold them to account, really. So
Yeah.
is that a good strategy? Does it make sense? How are the police likely to respond to that? And do you have any observations or comments about that?
Yeah. I mean, it does make sense. And what I would say is, as a solicitor, certainly at trial, that's the worst thing a
Right.
client could do. I
Right.
would always say, whatever you do, answer the questions.
Right.
And that is also, you're being cross-examined by a barrister or King's Counsel, who are highly, highly trained to cross-examine. So
Mm.
that never comes across well. And I had a defendant in the witness box for like 8, 9 days who didn't answer one question, and it was because he was actually in a lot of hot water, and he almost waived legal privilege and all sorts of stuff. So, and it really, I think the difficulty is, and I'm totally with you that I get, that would be an extremely reasonable response in these circumstances. But I think the police's response, it would make more sense if you didn't have a solicitor. If you had a solicitor present, the police would be like, well, your solicitor's told you why you're here and we want to talk to you about X, Y, Z. That is likely to be their response. And also, as the solicitor, I would want my client putting their best foot forward and stating the facts. If they're answering the questions, stating the facts that the police then need to check on, or the defence that they're actually relying on. Saying that, if someone did that once or twice, this is ridiculous, I can't believe you're asking me these questions, and then answering it, then that goes and follows. And it depends on the circumstances also. If you're as unfortunately happens a lot, someone's in custody for the murder of a loved one, you'd be like, why the hell aren't you out there looking for the person who's done XYZ? you know in that scenario, it
Mm.
would 100% make sense. But there's that fine line, isn't there? And also, as I said, there's that criticism of women stepping in to that authority, and as we've talked about, um there could have been a stronger line kind of drawn there, for her, and potentially, thing I always liked about written statements is that some of the defence didn't get lost. It was very clear. I'm quite like that, quite a clear,
Mm.
concise, this is what it is. That I do wonder what the power of that would have been at the trial, and whether any more control of the narrative could be made, because the trial couldn't have gone any worse for her, really.
Oh, no. It's just for me. I would be angry, I suppose. I would certainly be annoyed if I was arrested for something that I knew I hadn't done. And I felt for Lucy, her outlook was, I will comply with this process and everything will be okay. Whereas my attitude would be, why is this process taking place?
Mm,
And I would want to challenge that. Now, maybe that could be used against me. I don't know, but Lucy complied and that was used against her anyway.
yeah,
So, so I
yeah,
feel like there's nothing to be lost by just saying, why are you asking me about these allegations? I know nothing about them. Why I'm in this police station? Why are you asking me if I took home medical documents? Why are you asking me these kind of arcane questions?
yeah.
Um, I
And I
feel
think,
like,
as I said, I wouldn't have a problem with that in an interview unless that was all that was said. I'd
hmm,
be like, well, there's no point in us answering these questions. If that's all we're going to say,
hmm.
uh, if that's all you're going to say, I would put that in a written statement.
Because very early on, the police claim that they were doing an information gathering exercise. Now, I'm skeptical of that because they'd arrested her, of course, but they do say we wanted Lucy to. I think this is completely unreasonable, of course, ludicrous even, but we wanted Lucy to say something in her defense, basically. So maybe one of the best things she could have said was, "Why on earth am I here in the first place?"
Yeah,
Would be my
yeah.
thinking.
Because one of the things as well, as I said, I used, and not to distract from what we're talking about, but I use self-defense as a primary example, because one of the things the police look for is time and place. I mean, they had that from Dowie Evans apparently, but um, the minute you give them that, oh, well, she's accepted everything, that she was
Hmm.
there when we said she was, so
Hmm.
therefore, and I was always very wary of giving them that, if I didn't need to,
Hmm.
on behalf of the client, because when you give the police time and place. They can. I'm not saying they do fit the rest of the evidence, but this was a clear case of confirmation bias where there was one hypothesis, and that's what they did,
Mm.
unfortunately. And I'm quite happy to put that out there. That's my opinion on it, because it's quite clear that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's undeniable, frankly, considering what we know now. I don't see
And it
how they
gets
could
worse
possibly,
the more and more that comes out.
yeah, I don't see how they could possibly claim otherwise. I mean, if they were going to claim otherwise, they, I mean, their contention that they tried to put forward in their film, that even at the time I thought, well, based on what you've shown me, this has no credibility at all. Now that was days after it happened. Now we know a hell of a lot more. They would have to be able to show clear evidence that they seriously considered and examined and investigated other possibilities. Now, I'm almost 100% certain they won't be able to show that because because we know quite a lot now, and there's absolutely no evidence they ever did that.
No,
So
no.
I would be
And
extremely,
it raises a question for me that I'd never really thought about before. Although often the defense, as I said, the best thing is to say nothing at all. But the fact that of the PR, we talk about quality of arms, the level of PR that they had. You know, when Lucy's in a position, even her own best friend was too scared and fearful because of the venom that was out there in the public to stand up on her behalf. We need to be asking some serious questions about how that has been dealt with, because that's just unacceptable
yeah,
in my view. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. So I want to ask you a couple of technical questions now because you told me some things that I certainly didn't know.
Yeah.
So you explained to me, so as far as we know, the person who's with Lucy is a solicitor. We, I don't think we know that with 100% certainty, but I've always assumed it was a solicitor. But you told me that there can be situations where it wouldn't be a solicitor. So can you just explain that?
Yeah. We as a firm, and lots of firms do use legal representatives who are qualified, so they do the police station accreditation course, that everyone has to do to give legal advice at the police station, but they are not a qualified solicitor, or litigator. So they can be a paralegal or a trainee, or ex-police officers do that role. They can be, some representatives have their own, they're a freelancer and that is what they do. And I don't know where that sits now in the criminal justice climate, which is far from improved. It was in a pretty appalling mess when I left, but we had to rely on them as solicitors because of legal aid cuts being huge. And we slimlined our department massively, because we had to. So you've only got a certain amount of solicitors, and also when you're a court advocate and I remember as I got older, there's almost a shelf life of doing that job.
Mm.
I'd be at the police station. The police never understood that we were at court in the morning, that we didn't work shifts.
Mm.
You'd be there till 2 in the morning, and then you're suddenly in court at 9:30, feeling like you've had some massive night out or something. And so we had to balance things out there, and that's
Mm.
something that we would do. But what I would say, I mean, I'm not entirely against it, but what I would say is legal reps would give advice that I wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I would demand a solicitor.
Hmm. Yeah, because it's that. And also legal representatives would be worried about things that I wasn't. And I remember a legal rep saying to me once, and he'd been doing it a long time. Oh, you need to be careful. And I was like, I don't care. They can arrest my client for what they like. They've got no evidence whatsoever. So, if they want to play that game with me, that's fine. I'm not worried about it. But he would, you know, maybe worry about that. Um, Whereas I knew how things played out in court, so I know what's evidence and what isn't.
Mm.
Um, and I know, so as did the other solicitors. And also when I left, as a point to note, I was also, there were lots of civilian workers who were starting to do interviews. So I was like, interesting. So we've got a civilian worker doing the interview and not a police officer, and then we've got a legal representative and not a solicitor on the other side. That's going to increase miscarriages of justice, in my view.
Yeah, it doesn't sound ideal, that's for sure. Um, So I want to ask you this question about Paul Hughes, and now we know Danielle Stonier has said this as well. So they both said Lucy should have been banging on the table in the interview saying, "I'm innocent, I'm innocent," and volubly remonstrating with the police, proclaiming her innocence. So I find that an extraordinary remark from one police officer, but now we know Danielle Stonier said exactly the same thing. So that really they've either both said that independently or they've got together and said, "Oh, this would be a good story. Let's both tell the Daily Mail this." But either way, it's extraordinarily inappropriate and stupid. Do you have any comments on that from your experience?
Yeah, I just agree. I mean, I was going to say, I think any client that probably did that, they probably weren't, right? They're just,
Yeah.
playing the system and being annoyed of like you've accused me of doing X or whatever because um it's not a realistic expectation of someone who has never been in custody before. I mean, as I said at the outset, it's so once when I was a duty solicitor, which is it just meant we got duty slots, and they brought an 85-year-old in custody on a Sunday morning, which they could have arrested by appointment. So I spoke to the custody sergeant, said, "I'm not dealing with anyone else until we get that guy out of here. Like, what's, again, of good character." So, because I, again, being empathetic, this experience, we're there every Sunday morning or whatever. It's all usual for us. But for that person, it really isn't. It's, which when I was at university, people confess to things they haven't done. I was like, surely not. I mean, they do all the time. There's so much evidence of that. And people will say things because they just think they might get to go home sooner rather than later. I don't know if you've ever been in a police cell. They're pretty horrendous. The toilet is in there. They'll deliver you a pasty or something through the hatch, and a hot chocolate that it's so dehumanizing,
Mm.
as well as the fact, again, had she done that, she'd be called unfeminine and aggressive and told to calm down, and all of the things. It wouldn't have worked in her favor, and we go back to how she's expected to perform innocence.
Yeah, and it I think leaving aside the fact that it's ridiculous, which is obvious, why should the police be looking at someone and saying, right, this is how we would expect them to behave so that they can communicate their innocence to me? That just seems preposterous to me.
Yeah,
They
and they're not
completely.
behavioral experts. They
No.
have behavioral experts. you know Bring one of them
Mm.
in. Why didn't you get one of them to look at the notes?
Well, that would be a question about so many things that happen, wouldn't it? I mean, why? I think some of this as well must be directed at the defense, but why didn't they? There are so many things they could have done.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's so many things they could have done that they didn't, that they never did.
I know, and
And
I don't know if it was. I think one of your other legal people, said overconfidence. You've got the
mm,
barrister who's bringing the case, and he was brilliant at cross examination from what I've seen, and of course he's going to be as King's Counsel, and then you've got the solicitors on the back end. You know, uh, who are the instructors? They're the people that instruct. Although that balance of power isn't always there. It depends, how that unfolds. But whether it was, I don't know, lack of funding, you have to apply to the Legal Service Commission for experts. There's not endless pots of money for the defence, and quite often as well they could be like, oh, you have to be responding to something, or they'd want something ridiculous like you having to put it into hourly rates, but the expert doesn't charge hourly rates. There were all sorts of barriers we had with experts, as well as ones potentially not wanting to give evidence in a case of this magnitude, or they they give you the report and it's not fit for purpose. I had that. I was like, what on earth is that? I've paid for
mm,
that. And that's, A, it's no good to me, and B, I don't agree with the opinion. They're the expert, but um again, they're even defense experts, particularly in cases like this involving infants, children, animals. People can come biased quite quick.
mm, yeah. I mean, no one is completely objective, of course. We all have these inbuilt cognitive biases. So um, I think it's a real like next time we speak, I want to get into some of the more systemic stuff as well that we won't have time to cover today. But I think it's a real problem as to how you get an objective process when it involves children, and particularly when it involves babies, because it's inherently emotive. And just obviously in this case, one of the things you can do immediately is the prosecution were allowed to make it as emotive as possible by interviewing all the parents at great lengths and getting loads of emotive testimony into the court case, which had no evidential value. So, in my view, that just shouldn't be there. Um,
Well, that could have been
but
dealt with by admissions. It's admitted that they lost a child, and there's that, and that's awful. So I don't understand what was happening um at that point. Although, judges, as in other, and again, I hate to keep going back to serial killers, but that is the road that they were taking, and still are, almost have not exactly a political interest, but a public interest in terms of being seen to be doing justice. And there are times when that works, including with Peter Sutcliffe, as I said. And I only found this out relatively recently. The prosecution were going to accept a manslaughter charge,
hmm,
but those horrendous offences that he committed, and the judge said no, we're having our trial. And
hmm,
he was right to do that, actually. So it's a really difficult um, balance. But yeah, that emotion, allowing that emotion to lead in a case like this, is dangerous beyond for miscarriage of justice. Again, when we look at the history of women being implicated in these types of cases, and I do wonder if anyone did that. The defense certainly wouldn't have had the funding to do that, but it's and I sometimes take for granted, some of the stuff that I'm interested in, and criminology background, that I forget other lawyers don't come from in crime, don't come from that
hmm.
analysis. They're very process driven.
Yeah, you can see that. I mean, again, I'm not going to ask you this question today, but I want to ask you about that because you mentioned something to me, and it really resonated with me because I look at the outlook of legal people sometimes to me is like surreal, almost. Like they just don't seem to look at things the same way that I would.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you know,
And I used to find that frustrating because yeah,
because you
it's
can't get away from it. You can't go away from the fact that it's supposed to be we're investigating something that happened and we're trying to get the truth of what happened in the real world. That's ultimately, if that's not the reason, the justification or the rationale behind the court system, why does it even exist? I mean, that's the only reason it exists, surely. It's
yeah,
not so you can say, oh yeah, procedurally this is the case and procedurally that is the case. So based on that, it's reasonable to say this and that's all okay. That's
yeah.
fine. But that's nothing to do with what happened in the real world.
No, and the result of that is those procedural decisions. I felt like, left Lucy, with an account that A, wasn't listened to, it was dismissed from the off, and B, like, lacked any institutional corroboration or context whatsoever. Because whilst the defence made applications to no case to answer and to exclude the evidence of Dowie Evans, and all those right procedural all things, which the judge seemed to not agree with any applications they made, is Lucy was left with the plumber
Hmm.
and no context whatsoever,
Hmm.
which made it really hard for the jury, whilst even though there was no proper evidence, for them to understand how she found herself in that situation. Um, you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
it's
Yeah, it's very regrettable. I think we can say.
yeah,
So just
and and just that it's happened before, that I was horrified that we're in 20, well, when she was convicted 2023.
mm, well, it seems
Yeah,
that very little has been learned
yeah, yeah,
from previous miscarriages. But what I mean, I do think if there can be a silver lining of this very dark cloud, it can be that we must learn. Surely this time this is going to be enormous. Surely we're going to learn some lessons from it this time.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was going to say to you, because I don't know, was anything said in her interviews about the grievance procedure
Yeah, so
at all?
I can't really comment about police interviews because there's so little available. So I couldn't really answer that question confidently with regard to her interviews. However, it is mentioned in the court case. So some people think it's not mentioned at all. That's not true. It is mentioned, but it's not given the contextual weight that it should be given. And really, the important thing that I don't know how the police have allowed this to happen, but the grievance procedure is fundamentally against Brewery and JRAM, even though the other consultants have signed off on it and they had to send a letter of apology. Brewery's driving the process, no doubt. JRAM is his most enthusiastic supporter, no doubt. And yet somehow the police have allowed them to be centrally involved in the investigation of Lucy Letby and even select the cases and even identify some of the cases they used in court. Then they're in court giving evidence against her, basically. And at the same time, the court never hears contextually about the grievance procedure and the fact that the grievance procedure was against the people that have resulted in this case going to court. It's an extraordinary situation.
Yeah.
I think if you were to make it up in a fiction story, people would say it's too far-fetched, unless you
Yeah.
did it really satirically. If you tried to make it like socially realistic, people would say, "Oh, I mean, that couldn't happen. The police would never do that."
Mm.
But they
Yeah.
did.
And it opened up, and I don't know, and again, I'm not criticizing defense. I know how tough the job is, and again, working with hindsight here is that could have, and in my view, maybe should have, opened an abusive process argument before the trial even started. I mean, given that the judge's decisions were what they were, I don't think it would have been successful. But yeah, it's interesting because how police investigate and the order of that and who's involved, and all of that, it can create a situation where the evidence is contaminated and but again, that is a hard thing for the defense to untangle. Often it sits within the unused material, and all of that. So but my feeling was is that the grievance didn't take a central role, which was bizarre.
Well, I mean, the only reason I became interested in it is because there's this Observer article where Paul Hughes describes the consultants as the golden thread in the investigation. And I wish I could go back in time and see and read that article as I did at the time. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, but aren't they? And this was days after I'd heard about it. I'd only heard about the conviction days, but I was already pretty convinced by this point that it could be miscarriage of justice. So I remember reading this article and I'm going, but weren't they the accusers of Lucy Letby? How are they the golden thread in the investigation? And then it goes on and on. And then so I became very interested in the police angle, I think, quite early on. And I don't want to like blow my own trumpet, but I do think that it wasn't focused on that much until and obviously the media has done stuff as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I did feel from that point this could be a very incompetent police investigation because I was already starting to look at the Operation Hummingbird documentary, but now we just know. Now we know everything they did wrong and we know everything that went wrong. But it's
Yeah.
just a shame that this they should never have been allowed procedurally to involve Brewery and JRAM in selecting the cases. I mean, how the hell can you possibly allow someone to walk into the police station and say, "We believe it's a nurse," and in that meeting on the 15th of May, they make it crystal clear that it's Lucy. It couldn't be any clearer. That unless they just literally said Lucy Letby's killed all these babies, you better do something about it. That's the only way they could have made it clearer. And then the police say to them, "Oh, why don't you select some of the cases you're suspicious about?" How can that possibly happen? How?
Yeah, and it's funny, and yeah, and you're the person that's done the most work on this. And I listened to there's a crime podcast that I like as I've got back into crime the last couple of years, as I said, two female presenters, and I really like their stuff. And I listened to their one on Lucy, and I was literally shouting at my phone as I was listening to it because they were saying, "Oh well, the consultants have," and I'm not saying they are lying, but the consultants have no reason to lie. But I was like, they've got every reason. They're responsible for the ward. What are you talking about? It's institutionally responsible. They've got every reason, not simply to lie, but to pass the buck and chuck it down the line. I was like, what is this? This is bonkers to me. How can you possibly say that? Because that was the first that I knew that that they were involved, and that just blew my mind. And to be fair to them, they've done a
Mhm.
podcast apology since the
Mhm.
panel event with
Yeah, I've
Mark
seen
McDonald.
that. I've
Oh
seen that
my
one.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought you were
So,
referring to that one.
pardon?
I thought you were probably referring to that one because I've seen the one where credit to them because
Yeah.
some people have doubled down and some people have refused to admit they were wrong, and they have been happy to admit that, and credit to them for doing that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because I did almost send them an email as well about some of the stereotyping of women. I was like, again, I kept saying this is not your world anymore, but I was just like, no, 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 and I really value their stuff. So, but yeah, good on them to,
Yeah,
and we've got to accept mistakes when they happen. And half the reason these situations perpetuate and continue throughout history is because they're not accepted.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I just want to finish by asking you a couple more questions. So when we spoke last, you mentioned to me concerns about possible contamination, as you described it, with police suggesting possibly to parents their infants have been deliberately harmed, and then that informing the investigation. So could you discuss that firstly?
Yeah, that's just what I said just before in terms of, how they investigate. Not so much with speaking to the parents, but police contaminating their own investigation is, I wouldn't say necessarily common. I mean, it probably is, but
Hmm.
we won a few, particularly historical cases on an abusive process because of them going to speak to victims and saying, "Oh, X did that to them," maybe etc. So it made those coming forward not independent witnesses because they've been told X, Y, Z by the police previously. And as we've just talked about, how this investigation, a lot of that you've uncovered, the two consultants coming in, picking out cases, Dewey Evans, likely knowing her name, saying that, which again, is not time for that now. That there's no statistics in this case, which is, and I feel like that was done because of all the Roy Meadows stuff, in all honesty.
Hmm.
That we'll just push that out. And I'm first to say, as a trained lawyer, I don't understand statistics either. But what I do know, and I think they need a more kind of human response, but it's not a reason to say, oh well, the jury won't understand that, because really we don't either. So we'll just not include it, but we'll rely on statistics through the back door, which is
Hmm.
kind of happened. All of that, which again is easier in hindsight that it was for the defence at the time, but these cases, including baby shame cases that I did do, they can look really weirdly convincing on the outset. And I think if there's a lesson for any lawyers is to absolutely dig into the investigation, what's gone wrong with it, something. There'll be something, and that's always in the unused material.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And then literally the absolutely final thing I'd like to ask you, which I only learned myself a few days ago,
Yeah.
is that Danielle Stonier, who was a family liaison officer who worked with the families for over 2 years, then conducted two-thirds of Lucy's interviews in 2019 and 2020. So she spent approximately 16 hours interviewing Lucy, having spent over 2 years becoming invested with the families. Even Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham described her as invested in the case. So, would you like to comment on that as well, finally?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's something I was listening to the other day that was saying, is there room for, this is more in domestic violence, for independent investigators, because 9 times out of 10, if not more, the officer interviewing is involved, in the case somewhere, talking to victims, alleged victims, etc. I mean, although it's interesting as a family liaison officer that was her role, and the length of this investigation would have amplified how she felt about what she believed had happened, and justice in inverted commas, for the parents of those babies who've had an awful experience. So I would like to see justice for Lucy's parents as well,
Hmm.
um, because I can only imagine what they've been through. So it's difficult. Did that mean she was less objective? Yeah, absolutely. Was she going to be objective anyway? Probably not,
Hmm.
um, because of all the other aspects. What I do find interesting, I think the first interview as well, I would say it was a deliberate strategy that Lucy was interviewed by a woman, for a false sense of security.
Right,
And this is just a chat.
right.
And I was always very, very dubious when police or investigators of DWP or wherever went down that road, of it's just a chat. We're just exploring, be comfortable, because ultimately it's a confrontational environment. it is what it
They're
is.
not your friend, are they? Let's be fair.
Absolutely not. They're absolutely not. And yeah, it's again. I hope she understood that, but
No, she didn't, did she? I mean, again, she didn't understand that. She absolutely went into interview thinking, if I tell the truth, the police will say, "Oh, thank you, Lucy. Off you go."
yeah,
That's
yeah.
what
And
she
as
thought.
you said, and I totally, being expected of a nurse, which is another thing the press kept on saying. She was highly I was like, how are you highly qualified at 3 years? How can she put?
Mm,
And I've got no doubt of her competence, but um, she was you know, asked to give a universal account of everything that went in that hospital. And also, actually, what I forgot to say, as a lawyer, I would have had alarm bells. Not because and it's not for me to decide whether she did anything wrong or not, but
mm,
you also have manslaughter by gross negligence. So I would have been concerned about that for the ward as a whole, and that my client, who's junior, is going to take the hit for that. Forget the murder stuff. That's what that would have been an alarm bell for me, which again is why I'd be anxious about her answering questions, and if I'd always err on the side of caution. Ultimately, it would be for her to decide, but I think I've heard you say before, and it's right, in those situations, 99.9 times out of 10, particularly good character, they'll follow solicitor's advice.
yeah.
Even
Oh, yeah. I
highly
mean,
qualified. They don't go, no,
that's
no,
with,
I'm going to do this.
well, no, that's with regard to the, because they always say, "Oh, Lucy's decided to do this, or Lucy decided that." Well, she's not going to. I mean, what's she going to do? She's been in prison for. She's hardly going to run her own defense strategy, is she? She's got
No,
no
no, no.
qualification.
Or say to the King's Counsel, oh, I'm not going to call that witness. What we're going to do is this.
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
the
joke.
expert.
It's not even worth taking seriously. I mean, I just find it embarrassing that people will rate. People will say, "Oh, but Lucy decided this," and Lucy, "Oh, yeah, of course she did. Yeah, she's rotting away in prison every day, scared shitless. But she's
Yeah,
hardly
and I,
going to get a coin of embarrassment. Oh, yeah, well, yeah, thanks for your opinion, court. If I embarrassed her, but I think we'll run with a case like this. I mean, come on, did you like? It's just no way.
oh, no, and with the female, so I can't remember her name. Is it Danielle? You mentioned some of the previous. So I know about one of those cases of she's dealt with some highly
Mm,
manipulative, as police, not very nice. And I know with those types of crimes that is how they behave. So she's read really normal behavior into something highly manipulative
mm,
because that's what she's been around. You know,
yeah, yeah,
which is yeah,
yeah,
where we are, where we are.
yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll end it there. We haven't got halfway through the questions, so you'll definitely be coming back.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for joining. It's been really interesting. I knew we'd have a great conversation, and I mean, there's so many more questions I can ask you. So hopefully, you'll be a regular guest over the next few months. It's going to be a busy year for me. I've no idea what's going to happen, but we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your unique perspective. It's been really interesting. I know people are going to enjoy listening to this, and I'm sure they'll look forward to having you back as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no worries. See ya.